The Last of the Mohicans by James Fenimore Cooper. Chapter 9. Be gay securely, dispel, my fair, with smiles the timorous clouds that hang on thy clear brow. Death of Agrippina. The sudden and almost magical change from the stirring incidents of the combat to the stillness that now reigned around him acted on the heated imagination of Hayward like some exciting dream. While all the images and events he had witnessed remained deeply impressed on his memory, he felt a difficulty in persuading him of their truth. Still ignorant of the fate of those who had trusted to the aid of the swift current, he at first listened intently to any signal or sounds of alarm which might announce the good or evil fortune of their hazardous undertaking. His attention was, however, bestowed in vain, for with the disappearance of Uncas, every sign of the adventurers had been lost, leaving him in total uncertainty of their fate. In a moment of such painful doubt, Duncan did not hesitate to look around him, without consulting that protection from the rocks which, just before, had been so necessary to his safety. Every effort, however, to detect the least evidence of their approach of their hidden enemies was as fruitless as the inquiry after his late companions. The wooded banks of the river seemed again deserted by everything possessing animal life. The uproar which had so lately echoed through the vaults of the forest was gone, leaving the rush of the waters to swell and sink on the currents of the air in the unmingled sweetness of nature. A fish-hawk, which, secure on the topmost branches of a dead pine, had been a distant spectator of the fray, now swooped from his high and ragged perch and soared in wide sweeps above his prey, while a jay, whose noisy voice had been stilled by the hoarser cries of the savages, ventured again to open his discordant throat, as though once more in undisturbed possession of his wild domains. Duncan caught from these natural accompaniments of the solitary scene a glimmering of hope, and he began to rally his faculties to renewed exertions with something like a reviving confidence of success. "The Hurons are not to be seen," he said, addressing David, who had by no means recovered from the effects of the stunning blow he had received. "Let us conceal ourselves in the cavern, and trust the rest to Providence." "I remember to have united with two comely maidens in lifting up our voices in praise and thanksgiving," returned the bewildered singing-master, "since which time I have been visited by a heavy judgment for my sins. I have been mocked with the likeness of sleep, while sounds of discord have rent my ear, such as might manifest the fullness of time, and that nature had forgotten her harmony. Poor fellow, thine own period was, in truth, near its accomplishment, but arouse, and come with me. I will lead you where all the other sounds but those of your own psalmody shall be excluded. There is melody in the fall of the cataract, and the rushing of my many waters is sweet to the senses," said David, pressing his hand confusedly to his brow. "Is not the air yet filled with shrieks and cries, as though the departed spirits of the damned—" "Not now, not now," interrupted the impatient Hayward. "They have ceased, and they who raised them, I trust in God, they are gone too. Everything but the water is still and at peace, and then, where you may create these sounds you love so well to hear." David smiled sadly, though not without a momentary gleam of pleasure at this allusion to his beloved vocation. He no longer hesitated to be led to a spot which promised such unalloyed gratification to his wearied senses, and leaning on the arm of his companion, he entered the narrow mouth of the cave. Duncan seized a pile of the sassafras which he drew before the passage, studied studiously concealing every appearance of an aperture. Within this fragile barrier, he arranged the blankets abandoned by the foresters, darkening the inner extremity of the cavern, while its outer received a chastened light from the narrow ravine, through which one arm of the river rushed to form the junction with its sister branch a few rods below. "I like not the principles of the natives, which teaches them to submit without a struggle in emergencies that appear desperate," he said, while busied in this employment. "Our own maxim says, 'While life remains, there is hope,' is more consoling and better suited to a soldier's temperament. To you, Cora, I will urge no words of idle encouragement. Your own fortitude and undisturbed reason will teach you all that may become your sex, but cannot we dry the tears of that trembling weeper on your bosom?" I am calmer, Duncan," said Alice, raising herself from the arms of her sister and forcing an appearance of composure through her tears. "Much calmer now. Surely in this hidden spot we are safe. We are secret, free from injury. We will hope everything from those generous men who have risked so much already in our behalf." "Now does our gentle Alice speak like a daughter of a Monroe," said Hayward, pausing to press her hand as he passed toward the outer entrance of the cavern. "With two such examples of courage before him, a man would be ashamed to prove other than a hero." He then seated himself in the center of the cavern, grasping his remaining pistol with a hand convulsively clenched, while his contracted and frowning eye announced the sullen desperation of his purpose. "The Hurons, if they come, may not gain our position so easily as they think," he muttered slowly, and, propping his head back against the wall, seemed to await the result in patience, though his gaze was unceasingly bent on the open avenue to their place of retreat. With the last sound of his voice, a deep, a long, and almost breathless silence succeeded. The fresh air of the morning had penetrated the recess, and its influence was gradually felt on the spirits of its inmates. As minute after minute passed by, leaving them in undisturbed security, the insinuating feeling of hope was gradually gaining possession of every bosom, though each one felt reluctant to give utterance to expectations that the next moment might so fearfully destroy. David alone formed an exception to these varying emotions. A gleam of light from the opening crossed his wan countenance and fell upon the pages of the little volume whose leaves he was again occupied in turning, as if searching for some song more fitted to their condition than any that had yet met their eye. He was most probably acting all this time under a confused recollection of the promised consolation of Duncan. At length, it would seem, his patient industry found its reward, for, without explanation or apology, he pronounced aloud the words, "Isle of Wight," drew a long, sweet sound from his pitch pipe, and then ran through the preliminary modulations of the air whose name he had just mentioned, with the sweeter tones of his own musical voice. "May not this prove dangerous?" asked Cora, glancing her dark eye at Major Hayward. "Poor fellow, his voice is too feeble to be heard above the din of the falls," was the answer. "Besides, the cavern will prove his friend. Let him indulge his passion, since it may be done without hazard." "Isle of Wight," repeated David, looking about him with that dignity with which he had long been wont to silence the whispering echoes of his school. "'Tis a brave tune, and set to solemn words. Let it be sung with meet respect." After following a moment of stillness to enforce his discipline, the voice of the singer was heard in low, murmuring syllables, gradually stealing on the ear until it filled the narrow vault with sounds rendered trebly thrilling by the feeble and tremulous utterance produced by his debility. The melody, which no weakness could destroy, gradually wrought its sweet influence on the senses of those who heard it. It even prevailed over the miserable travesty of the Song of David, which the singer had selected from a volume of similar effusions, and caused the sense to be forgotten in the insinuating harmony of the sounds. Alice unconsciously dried her tears and bent her melting eyes on the pallid features of Gamut, with an expression of chastened delight that she neither affected or wished to conceal. Cora bestowed an approving smile on the pious efforts of the namesake of the Jewish prince, and Hayward soon turned his steady, stern look from the outlet of the cavern to fasten it, with a milder character, on the face of David, or to meet the wondering beams which at moments strayed from the humid eyes of Alice. The open sympathy of the listeners stirred the spirit of the votary of music, whose voice regained its richness and volume, without losing in touching softness which proved its secret charm. Exerting his renovated powers to their utmost, he was yet filling the arches of the cave with long and full tones, when a yell burst into the air without, that instantly stilled his pious strains, choking his voice suddenly, as though his heart had literally bounded into the passage of his throat. "We are lost!" exclaimed Alice, throwing herself into the arms of Cora. "No, not yet, not yet!" returned the agitated but undaunted Hayward. "The sound came from the center of the island, and it has been produced by the sight of their dead companions. We are not yet discovered, and there is still hope." Faint and almost despairing as was the prospect of escape, the words of Duncan were not thrown away, for it awakened the power of the sisters in such a manner that they awaited the results in silence. A second yell soon followed the first, when a rush of voices was heard pouring down the island from its upper to its lower extremity, until they reached the naked rock above the caverns, where, after a shout of savage triumph, the air continued full of horrible cries and screams, such as man alone can utter, and he only when in a state of the fiercest barbarity. The sounds quickly spread around them in every direction. Some called to their fellows from the water's edge, and were answered from the heights above. Cries were heard in the startling vicinity of the chasm between the two caves, which mingled with hoarser yells that arose out of the abyss of the deep ravine. In short, so rapidly had the savage sounds diffused themselves over the barren rock that it was not difficult for the anxious listeners to imagine they could be heard beneath, as in truth they were above on every side of them. In the midst of this tumult, a triumphant yell was raised within a few yards of the hidden entrance to the cave. Hayward abandoned every hope, with the belief it was the signal that they were discovered. Again the impression passed away as he heard the voices collected near the spot where the white man had so reluctantly abandoned his rifle. Amid the jargon of Indian dialects that he now plainly heard, it was easy to distinguish not only words but sentences in the patois of the Canadas. A burst of voices had shouted simultaneously, "La Longue Carabine!" causing the opposite woods to re-echo with the name which, Hayward well remembered, had been given by his enemies to a celebrated hunter and scout of the English camp, and who, he now learned for the first time, had been his late companion. "La Longue Carabine! La Longue Carabine!" passed from mouth to mouth until the whole band appeared to be collected around a trophy which would seem to announce the death of its formidable owner. After a vociferous consultation, which was, at times, deafened by bursts of savage joy, they again separated, filling the air with the name of a foe whose body could collect from their expressions they hoped to find concealed in some crevice of the island. "Now," he whispered to the trembling sisters, "now is the moment of uncertainty. If our place of retreat escape this scrutiny, we are still safe. In every extent we are assured by what has fallen from our enemies that our friends have escaped, and in 2 short hours we may look for succor from Webb." There were now a few minutes of fearful stillness, during which Hayward well knew that the savages conducted their search with greater vigilance and method. More than once he could distinguish their footsteps as they brushed the sassafras, causing the faded leaves to rustle and the branches to snap. At length the pile yielded a little. A corner of the blanket fell, and a faint ray of light gleamed into the inner part of the cave. Cora folded Alice to her bosom in agony, and Duncan sprang to his feet. A shout was at that moment heard, as if issuing from the center of the rock, announcing that the neighboring cavern had at length been entered. In a minute, the number and loudness of the voices indicated that the whole party was collected in and around that secret place. As the inner passages to the 2 caves were so close to each other, Duncan, believing that escape was no longer possible, passed David and the sisters to place himself between the latter and the first onset of the terrible meeting. Grown desperate by his situation, he drew nigh the slight barrier which separated him only by a few feet from his relentless pursuers, and placing his face to the casual opening, he even looked out with a sort of desperate indifference on their movements. Within reach of his arm was the brawny shoulder of a gigantic Indian, whose deep and authoritative voice appeared to give directions to the proceeding of his fellows. Beyond him, Duncan could look into the vault opposite, which was filled with savages, upturning and rifling the humble furniture of the scout. The wound of David had dyed the leaves of sassafras with a color that the native well knew as anticipating the season. Over this sign of their success, they sent up a howl like an opening from so many hounds who had recovered a lost trail. After this yell of victory, they tore up the fragrant bed of the cavern and bore the branches into the chasm, scattering the boughs as if they suspected them of concealing the person of the man they had so long hated and feared. One fierce and wild-looking warrior approached the chief, bearing a load of the brush and pointing exultingly to the deep red stains with which it was sprinkled, uttered his joy in Indian yells, whose meaning Hayward was only enabled to comprehend by the frequent repetition of the name, "Le Long Carabine." When his triumph had ceased, he cast the brush on the slight heap Duncan had made before the entrance of the second cavern, and closed the view. His example was followed by others who, as they drew the branches from the cave of the scout, threw them into one pile, adding, unconsciously, to the security of those they sought. The very slightness of the defense was its chief merit, for no one thought of disturbing the mass of brush, which all of them believed, in that moment of hurry and confusion, had been accidentally raised by the hands of their own party. As the blankets yielded before the outward pressure, and the branches settled in the fissure of the rock by their own weight, forming a compact body, Duncan once more breathed freely. With a light step and lighter heart, he returned to the center of the cave and took the place he had left, where he could command a view of the opening next to the river. While he was in the act of making the movement, the Indians, as if changing their purpose by a common impulse, broke away from the chasm in a body and were heard rushing up the island again toward the point whence they had originally descended. Here another wailing cry betrayed that they were again collected around the bodies of their dead comrades. Duncan now ventured to look at his companions, for during the most critical moments of their danger, he had been apprehensive that the anxiety of his countenance might communicate some additional alarm to those who were so little able to sustain it. "They are gone, Cora," he whispered. "Alice, they are returned whence they came, and we are saved. To heaven, that has alone delivered us from the grasp of so merciless an enemy, be all the praise." "Then to heaven I will return my thanks," exclaimed the younger sister, rising from the encircling arm of Cora and casting herself with enthusiastic gratitude on the naked rock. "To that heaven who has spared the tears of a gray-headed father, has saved the lives of those I so much love." Both Hayward and the more temperate Cora witnessed the act of involuntary emotion with powerful sympathy. The former secretly believing that piety had never worn a form so lovely as it had now assumed in the youthful person of Alice. Her eyes were radiant with the glow of grateful feelings. The flush of her beauty was again seated on her cheeks, and her whole soul seemed ready and anxious to pour out its thanksgivings through the medium of her eloquent features. But when her lips moved, the words they should have uttered appeared frozen by some new and sudden chill. Her bloom gave place to the paleness of death. Her soft and melting eyes grew hard and seemed contracting with horror, while those hands, which she had raised, clasped in each other toward heaven, dropped in horizontal lines before her, the fingers pointing forward in convulsed motion. Hayward turned the instant she gave a direction to his suspicions, and peering just above the ledge which formed the threshold of the open outlet of the cavern, he beheld the malignant, fierce, and savage features of Le Renard Subtil. In that moment of surprise, the self-possession of Hayward did not desert him. He observed by the vacant expression of the Indian's countenance that his eye, accustomed to the open air, had not yet been able to penetrate the dusky light which pervaded the depth of the cavern. He had even thought of retreating beyond a curvature in the natural wall, which might still conceal him and his companions, when by the sudden gleam of intelligence that shot across the features of the savage, he saw it was too late, and that they were betrayed. The look of exultation and brutal triumph which announced this terrible truth was irresistibly irritating. Forgetful of everything but the impulses of his hot blood, Duncan leveled his pistol and fired. The report of the weapon made the cavern bellow like an eruption from a volcano, and when the smoke it vomited had been driven away before the current of air which issued from the ravine, the place so lately occupied by the features of his treacherous guide was vacant. Rushing to the outlet, Hayward caught a glimpse of his dark figure stealing around a low and narrow ledge, which soon hid him entirely from sight. Among the savages, a frightful stillness succeeded the explosion, which had just been heard bursting from the bowels of the rock. But when Le Renard raised his voice in a long and intelligible whoop, it was answered by a spontaneous yell from the mouth of every Indian within hearing of the sound. The clamorous noises again rushed down the island, and before Duncan had time to recover from the shock, his feeble barrier of brush was scattered to the winds. The cavern was entered at both its extremities, and he and his companions were dragged from their shelter and borne into the day, where they stood surrounded by the whole band of triumphant Hurons. Chapter 10. I fear we shall outsleep the coming of morn, as much as we this night have overwatched. Midsummer Night's Dream. The instant this shock of this sudden misfortune had abated, Duncan began to make his observations on the appearance and proceedings of their captors. Contrary to the usages of the natives in the wantonness of their success, they had respected not only the persons of their trembling sisters, but his own. The rich ornaments of his military attire had indeed been repeatedly handled by different individuals of the tribes, with eyes expressing a savage longing to possess the baubles. But before the customary violence could be resorted to, a mandate in the authoritative voice of the large warrior, already mentioned, stayed the uplifted hand, and convinced Hayward that they were to be reserved for some object of particular moment. While, however, these manifestations of weakness were exhibited by the young and vain of the party, the more experienced warriors continued their search throughout both caverns with an activity that denoted they were far from being satisfied with those fruits of their conquest which had already been brought to light. Unable to discover any new victim, the These diligent workers of vengeance soon approached their male prisoners, pronouncing the name "Le Long Carabine" with a fierceness that could not be easily mistaken. Duncan affected not to comprehend the meaning of their repeated and violent interrogatories, while his companion was spared the effort of a similar deception by his ignorance of French. Wearied at length by their importunities, and apprehensive of irritating his captors by too stubborn a silence, the former looked about him in quest of Magua, who might interpret his answers to questions which were at the moment becoming more earnest and threatening. The conduct of this savage had formed a solitary exception to that of all his fellows. While the others were busily occupied in seeking to gratify their childish passion for finery, by plundering even the miserable effects of the scout, or had been searching with such bloodthirsty vengeance in their looks for their absent owner, Le Renard had stood at a little distance from the prisoners, with a demeanor so quiet and satisfied as to betray that he had already effected the grand purpose of his treachery. When the eyes of Hayward first met those of his recent guide, he turned them away in horror at the sinister though calm look he encountered. Conquering his disgust, however, he was able, with an averted face, to address his successful enemy. "Le Renard Subtil is too much of a warrior," said the reluctant Hayward, "to refuse telling an unarmed man what his conquerors say." "They ask for the hunter who knows the path through the woods," returned Magua, in his broken English, laying his hand at the same time with a ferocious smile on the bundle of leaves with which a wound on his own shoulder was bandaged. "Le Long Carabine. His rifle is good, and his eye never shut, but, like the short gun of the White Chief, it is nothing against the life of Le Subtil. Le Renard is too brave to remember that the hurts received in war, or the hands that gave them." "Was it war, when the tired Indian rested at the sugar tree to taste his corn? Who filled the bushes with creeping enemies? Who drew the knife? Whose tongue was peace, while his heart was colored with blood? Did Magua say that the hatchet was out of the ground, and that his hand had dug it up?" As Duncan dared not retort upon his accuser by reminding him of his own premeditated treachery, and disdained to deprecate his resentment by any words of apology, he remained silent. Magua seemed also content to rest the controversy as well as all further communication there, for he assumed the leaning attitude against the rock from which, in momentary energy, he had arisen. But the cry of "Le Long Carabine" was renewed the instant the impatient savages perceived that the short dialogue was ended. "You hear," said Magua with stubborn indifference. "The Red Hurons call for the life of Le Long Rifle, or they will have the blood of him that keep him hid." "He is gone, escaped. He is far beyond their reach." Renard smiled with cold contempt as he answered, "When the white man dies, he thinks he is at peace. But the red men know how to torture even the ghosts of their enemies. Where is his body? Let the Hurons see his scalp." "He is not dead, but escaped." Magua shook his head incredulously. "Is he a bird to spread his wings, or is he a fish to swim without air? The White Chief read in his books, and he believes the Hurons are fools." "Though no fish, the Long Rifle can swim. He floated down the stream when the powder was all burned and when the eyes of the Hurons were behind a cloud." "And why did the White Chief stay?" demanded the still incredulous Indian. Is he a stone that goes to the bottom, or does the scalp burn his head? Though I am not stone, your dead comrade, who fell into the falls, might answer were the life still in him, said the provoked young man, using in his anger that boastful language which most likely to excite the admiration of an Indian. The white man thinks none but cowards desert their women. Magua muttered a few words inaudibly between his teeth before he continued aloud. Can the Delaware swim, too, as well as crawl in the bushes? Where is Le Gros Serpent? Duncan, who perceived by the use of the Canadian appellations that his late companions were much better known to his enemies than to himself, answered reluctantly, He is also go down with the water. Le Cerf Agile is not here. I know not whom you call the nimble deer, said Duncan, gladly profiting by any excuse to create delay. Uncas, returned Magua, pronouncing the Delaware name with even greater difficulty than he spoke his English words. Bounding elk is what the white man says when he calls to the young Mohican. Here is the same confusion in names between us, Le Renard, said Duncan, hoping to provoke a discussion. Dame is the French for deer and surf for stag. Elan is the true term where one would speak of an elk. Yes, muttered the Indian in his native tongue. The pale faces are prattling women. They have 2 words for each thing, while a redskin will make the sound of his voice speak for him. Then, changing his language, he continued, adhering to the imperfect nomenclature of his provincial instructors. The deer is swift, but weak. The elk is swift, but strong. And the son of La Serpent is La Cerf Agile. Has he leaped the river to the woods? If you mean the younger Delaware, he, too, has gone down with the water. There was nothing improbable to an Indian in the manner of the escape. Magua admitted the truth of what he had heard, with a readiness that afforded additional evidence how little he would prize such worthless captives. With his companions, however, the feeling was manifestly different. The Hurons had awaited the result of this short dialogue with characteristic patience, and with a silence that increased until there was a general stillness in the band. When Hayward ceased to speak, they turned their eyes as one man on Magua, demanding in this expressive manner an explanation of what had been said. Their interpreter pointed to the river and made them acquainted with the result, as much by the action as by the few words he uttered. When the fact was generally understood, the savages raised a frightful yell which declared the extent of their disappointment. Some ran furiously to the water's edge, beating their air with their frantic gestures, while others spat upon the element to resent the supposed treason it had committed against their acknowledged rights as conquerors. A few, and they not the least powerful and terrific of the band, threw lowering looks in which the fiercest passion was only tempered by habitual self-command at those captives who still remained in their power, while 1 or 2 even gave vent their malignant feelings by the most menacing gestures, against which neither the sex nor the beauty of the sisters was any protection. The young soldier made a desperate but fruitless effort to spring to the side of Alice when he saw the dark hand of a savage twisted in the rich tresses which were flowing in volumes over her shoulders, while a knife was passed around the head from which they fell, as if to denote the horrid manner in which it was about to be robbed of its beautiful ornament. But his hands were bound, and at the first movement he made, he felt the grasp of the powerful Indian who directed the band, pressing his shoulder like a vice. Immediately conscious how unavailing any struggle against an overwhelming force must prove, he submitted to his fate, encouraging his gentle companions by a few low, and tender assurances that the natives seldom failed to threaten more than they performed. But while Duncan resorted to those words of consolation to quiet the apprehensions of the sisters, he was not so weak as to deceive himself. He well knew that the authority of the Indian chief was so little conventional that it was oftener maintained by physical superiority than by any moral supremacy he might possess. The danger was therefore magnified exactly in proportion to the number of the savage spirits by which they were surrounded. The most positive mandate from him who seemed the acknowledged leader was liable to be violated at each moment by any rash hand that might choose to sacrifice a victim to the manes of some dead friend or relative. While, therefore, he sustained an outward appearance of calmness and fortitude, his heart leaped into his throat whenever any of their fierce captors drew nearer than common to the helpless sisters, or fastened one of their sullen, wondering looks on those fragile forms which were so little able to resist the slightest assault. His apprehensions were, however, greatly relieved when he saw that the leader had summoned his warriors to himself in council. Their deliberations were short, and it would seem, by the silence of most of the party, the decision unanimous. By the frequency with which the few speakers pointed in the direction of the encampment of Webb, it was apparent they dreaded the approach of danger from that quarter. This consideration probably hastened their determination and quickened the subsequent movements. During his short conference, Hayward, finding a respite from his gravest fears, had leisure to admire the cautious manner in which the Hurons had made their approaches, even after hostilities had ceased. It has already been stated that the upper half of the island was a naked rock, and destitute of any other defenses than a few scattered logs or driftwood. They had selected this point to make their descent, having borne the canoe through the wood around the cataract for that purpose. Placing their arms in the little vessel, a dozen men clinging to its side had trusted themselves to the direction of the canoe, which was controlled by two of the most skillful warriors, in attitudes that enabled them to command a view of the dangerous passage. Favored by this arrangement, they touched the head of the island at that point which proved so fatal to their first adventurers, but with the advantages of superior numbers and the possession of firearms. That such had been the manner of their descent was rendered quite apparent to Duncan, for they now bore the light bark from the upper end of the rock, and placed it in the water near the mouth of the outer cavern. As soon as this change was made, the leader made signs to the prisoners to descend and enter. As resistance was impossible, and remonstrance useless, Hayward set the example of submission by leading the way into the canoe, where he was soon seated with the sisters and the still wondering David. Notwithstanding the Hurons were necessarily ignorant of the little channels among the eddies and rapids of the stream, they knew the common signs of such a navigation too well to commit any material blunder. When the pilot chosen for the task of guiding the canoe had taken his station, the whole band plunged again into the river. The vessel glided down the current. In a few moments the captives found themselves on the south bank of the stream, nearly opposite to the point where they had struck it the preceding evening. Here was held another short but earnest consultation, during which the horses, to whose panic their owners ascribed the heaviest misfortune, were led from the cover of the woods and brought to the sheltered spot. The band now divided. The great chief, so often mentioned, mounting the charger of Hayward, led the way directly across the river, followed by most of his people, and disappeared in the woods, leaving the prisoners in charge of 6 savages, at whose head was Le Renard Subtil. Duncan witnessed all their movements with renewed uneasiness. He had been fond of believing, from the uncommon forbearance of the savages, that he was reserved as a prisoner to be delivered to Montcalm. As the thoughts of those who are in misery seldom slumber, and the invention is never more likely than when it is stimulated by hope, however feeble and remote. He had even imagined that the parental feelings of Monroe were to be made instrumental in seducing him from his duty to the king. For though the French commander bore a high character for courage and enterprise, he was thought to be expert in those political practices which did not always respect the nicer obligations of morality, and which so generally disgraced the European diplomacy of that kind. All those busy and ingenious speculations were now annihilated by the conduct of his captors. The portion of the band who had followed the huge warrior took the route toward the foot of the Horican, and no other expectation was left for himself and companions than that they were to be retained as hopeless captives by their savage conquerors. Anxious to know the worst, and willing in such an emergency to try the potency of gold, he overcome his reluctance to speak to Magua. Addressing himself to his former guide, who had now assumed the authority and manner of one who was to direct the future movements of the party, he said, in tones as friendly and as confiding as he could assume, "I would speak to Magua what is fit only for so great a chief to hear." The Indian turned his eyes on the young soldier scornfully, and he answered, "Speak. Trees have no ears." "But the red Hurons are not deaf, and counsel that is fit for the great men of a nation would make the young warriors drunk. If Magua will not listen, the officer of the king knows how to be silent." The savage spoke carelessly to his comrades, who were busied, after their awkward manner, in preparing the horses for the reception of the sisters, and moved a little to one side, whither by a cautious gesture he induced Hayward to follow. "Now speak," he said. "If the words are such a Magua would hear." "Le Renard Subtil has proved himself worthy of the honorable name given him by his Canada fathers," commenced Hayward. "I see his wisdom, and all that he has done for us, and shall remember it when the hour to reward him arrives. Yes, Renard has proved that he is not only a great chief in council, but one who knows how to deceive his enemies." "What has Renard done?" coldly demanded the Indian. "What? Has he not seen that the woods were filled with outlying parties of the enemies, and that the serpent could not steal them without being seen? Then did he not lose his path to blind the eyes of the Hurons? Did he not pretend to go back to his tribe, who had treated him ill and driven him from their wigwams like a dog? And when he saw what he wished to, did we not aid him, by making a false face that the Hurons might think that the white man believed that this friend was his enemy? Is not all this true? And when Le Subtil had shut his eyes and stopped the ears of his nation by his wisdom, did they not forget that they had once done him wrong, and forced him to flee to the Mohawks? And did they not leave him on the south side of the river with their prisoners, while they have gone foolishly on to the north? Does not Renard mean to turn like a fox on his footsteps, and to carry to the rich and grey-headed Scotchmen his daughters? Yes, Magua, I see it all, and I have already been thinking how so much wisdom and honesty should be repaid. First, the chief of William Henry will give us a great chief should for such a service. The medal of Magua will no longer be of tin, but of beaten gold. His horn will run over with powder. Dollars will be as plenty in his pouch as pebbles on the shore of Hurricane. And the deer will lick his hand, for they will know it to be vain to fly from the rifle he will carry. As for myself, I know not how to exceed the gratitude of the Scotchmen, but I will." "What will the young chief, who comes from towards the sun, give?" demanded the Huron, observing that Hayward hesitated in his desire to end the enumeration of benefits with that which might form the climax of an Indian's wishes. He will make the fire water from the islands and the salt lake flow before the wigwam of Magua, until the heart of the Indian shall be lighter than the feathers of the hummingbird, and his breath sweeter than the wild honeysuckle. Le Renard had listened gravely as Hayward slowly proceeded in his subtle speech. When the young man mentioned the artifice he supposed the Indian to have practiced on his own nation, the countenance of the listener was veiled in an expression of cautious gravity. At the allusion to the injury which Duncan affected to believe had driven the Huron from his native tribe, a gleam of such ungovernable ferocity flashed from the other's eyes as induced to the adventurous speaker to believe he had struck the proper chord. And by the time he reached the part where he so artfully blended the thirst of vengeance with the desire of gain, he had at least obtained a command of the deepest attention of the savage. The question was put by Le Renard had been calm, and with all the dignity of an Indian, but it was quite apparent, by the thoughtful expression of the listener's countenance, that the answer was most cunningly devised. The Huron mused a few moments, and then, laying his hand on the rude bandages of his wounded shoulder, he said with some energy, "Do friends make such marks? Would la longue carabine cut one so slight on an enemy? Do the Delawares crawl upon those they love like snakes, twisting themselves to strike? Would Le Gros Serpent have been heard by the ears of one he wished to be deaf? Does the white chief burn his powder in the faces of his brothers? Does he ever miss his aim when seriously bent to kill?" returned Duncan, smiling with well-acted sincerity. Another long and deliberate pause succeeded these sententious questions and ready replies. Duncan saw that the Indian hesitated. In order to complete his victory, he was in the act of recommencing the enumeration of the rewards when Magua made an expressive gesture and said, "Enough. Le Renard is a wise chief, and what he does will be seen. Go and keep their mouths shut. When Magua speaks, it will be the time to answer." Hayward, perceiving the eyes of his companion were warily fastened on the rest of the band, fell back immediately in order to avoid the appearance of any suspicious confederacy with their leader. Magua approached the horses and affected to be well pleased with the diligence and ingenuity of his comrades. He then signed to Hayward to assist the sisters into the saddles, for he seldom deigned to use the English tongue unless urged by some motives of more than usual moment. There was no longer any plausible pretext for delay, and Duncan was obliged, however reluctantly, to comply. As he performed this office, he whispered his reviving hopes in the ears of the trembling females who, through dread of encountering the savage countenance of their captors, seldom raised their eyes from the ground. The mare of David had been taken with the followers of the large chief. In consequence, its owner, as well as Duncan, was compelled to journey on foot. The latter did not, however, so much regret this circumstance as it might enable him to retard the speed of the party, for he still turned his longing looks in the direction of Fort Edward, in the vain expectation of catching some sound from that quarter of the forest which might denote the approach of succor. When all were prepared, Magua made the signal to proceed, advancing in front to lead the party in person. Next followed David, who was gradually coming to a true sense of his condition, as the effects of the wound became less and less apparent. The sisters rode in his rear, with Hayward at their side, and while the Indians flanked the party and brought up the close of the march, with a caution that seemed never to tire. In this manner, they proceeded in uninterrupted silence, which, except when Hayward addressed some solitary word of comfort to the females, or David gave vent to the moanings of his spirit in piteous exclamations which he intended should express the humility of resignation. Their direction lay toward the south, and in a course nearly opposite to the road to William Henry. Notwithstanding this apparent adherence in Magua to the original determination of his conquerors, Hayward could not believe his tempting bait was so soon forgotten, and he knew the windings of an Indian's path too well to suppose that its apparent course led directly to its object, when artifice was at all necessary. Mile after mile was, however, passed through the boundless woods in this painful manner, without any prospect of a termination to their journey. Hayward watched the sun as he darted his meridian rays through the branches of the trees, and pined for the moment when the policy of Magua should change their route to one more favorable to his hopes. Sometimes he fancied the wary savage, despairing of passing the army of Montcalm in safety, was holding his way towards a well-known border settlement, where a distinguished officer of the crown and a favored friend of the Six Nations held his large possessions as well as his usual residence. To be delivered into the hands of Sir William Johnson was far preferable to being led into the wilds of Canada, but in order to effect even the former, it would be necessary to traverse the forest for many weary leagues, each step of which was carrying him further from the scene of the war, and consequently from the post not only of honor, but of duty. Cora alone remembered the parting injunctions of the scout, and whenever an opportunity offered, she stretched forth her arm to bend aside the twigs that met her hands. But the vigilance of the Indians rendered this act of precaution both difficult and dangerous. She was often defeated in this purpose by encountering their watchful eyes when it became necessary to feign an alarm she did not feel, and occupy the limb by some gesture of feminine apprehension. Once, and only once, was she completely successful when she broke down the bough of a large sumac, and, by a sudden thought, let her glove fall at the same instant. This sign, intended for those that might follow, was observed by one of her conductors, who restored the glove, broke the remaining branches of the brush in such a manner that it appeared to proceed from the struggling of some beast in its branches, and then laid his hand on his tomahawk, with a look so significant that it put an effectual end to those stolen memorials of their passage. As there were horses to leave the prints of their footsteps in both bands of the Indians, this interruption cut off any probable hopes of assistance being conveyed through the means of their trail. Hayward would have ventured a remonstrance had there been anything encouraging in the gloomy reserve of Magua. But the savage, during all this time, seldom turned to look at his followers, and never spoke. With the sun for his only guide, or aided by such blind marks as are only known to the sagacity of a native, he held his way along the barrens of pine, through occasional little fertile vales, across brooks and rivulets, and over undulating hills with the accuracy of instinct and nearly with the directness of a bird. He never seemed to hesitate. Whether the path was hardly distinguishable, whether it disappeared, or whether it lay beaten and plain before him, made no sensible difference in his speed or certainty. It seemed as if fatigue could not affect him. Whenever the eyes of the wearied travelers rose from the decayed leaves over which they trod, his dark form was to be seen glancing among the stems of the trees in front, his head immovably fastened in a fast-forward position, with the light plume on his crest fluttering in a current of air, made solely by the swiftness of his own motion. But all this diligence and speed were not without an object. After crossing a low vale, through which a gushing brook meandered, he suddenly ascended a hill so steep and difficult of ascent that the sisters were compelled to alight in order to follow. When the summit was gained, they found themselves on a level spot, but thinly covered with trees, under one of which Magua had thrown his dark form, as if willing and ready to seek that rest which was so much needed by the whole party. Chapter 11. Cursed be my tribe if I forgive him. Shylock. The Indian had selected for this desirable purpose one of those steep, pyramidal hills which bears a strong resemblance to artificial mounds, and which so frequently occur in the valleys of America. The one in question was high and precipitous, its top flattened as usual, but with one of its side more than ordinarily irregular. It possessed no other apparent advantage for a resting place than in its elevation and form, which might render defense easy and surprise nearly impossible. As Hayward, however, no longer expected that rescue which time and distance now rendered so improbable, he regarded these little peculiarities with an eye devoid of interest, devoting himself entirely to the comfort and condolence of his feebler companions. The Narragansetts were suffered to browse on the branches of the trees and shrubs that were thinly scattered over the summit of the hill, while the remains of their provisions were spread under the shade of a beech that stretched its horizontal limbs like a canopy above them. Notwithstanding the swiftness of their flight, one of the Indians had found an opportunity to strike a straggling fawn with an arrow, and had borne the more preferable fragment of the victim patiently on his shoulders to the stopping place. Without any aid from the science of cookery, he was immediately employed, in common with his fellows, in gorging himself with this digestible sustenance. Magua alone sat apart, without participating in the revolting meal, and apparently buried in the deepest thought. This abstinence, so remarkable in an Indian when he possessed the means of satisfying hunger, at length attracted the notice of Hayward. The young man willingly believed that the Huron deliberated on the most eligible manner of eluding the vigilance of his associates. With a view to assist his plans by any suggestion of his own, and to strengthen the temptation, he left the beach and straggled, as if without an object, to the spot where Le Renard was seated. "Has not Magua kept the sun in his face long enough to escape all danger from the Canadians?" he asked, as though no longer doubtful of the good intelligence established between them. "And will not the chief of William Henry be better pleased to see his daughters before another night may have hardened his heart to their loss, and make him less liberal in his reward?" "Do the pale faces love their children less in the morning than at night?" asked the Indian coldly. "By no means," returned Hayward, anxious to recall his error, if he had made one. "The white man may, and does often, forget the burial place of his fathers. He sometimes ceases to remember that he should love, and has promised to cherish, but the affection of a parent for his child is never permitted to die." "And is the heart of the white-haired chief soft? And will he think of the babes that his squaws have given him? He is hard on his warriors, and his eyes are made of stone." "He is severe to the idle and wicked, but to the sober and deserving he is a leader, both just and humane. I have known many fond and tender parents, but never have I seen a man whose heart was softer toward his child. You have seen the gray hair in front of his warriors, Magua, but I have seen his eyes swimming in water when he spoke of the children who are now in your power." Hayward paused, for he knew not how to construe the remarkable expression that gleamed across the swarthy features of the attentive Indian. At first it seemed as if the remembrance of that promised reward grew vivid in his mind, while he listened to the sources of parental feeling which were to assure its possession. But, as Duncan proceeded, the expression of joy became so fiercely malignant that it was not impossible not to apprehend its proceeded from some passion more sinister than avarice. "Go," said the Huron, suppressing the alarming exhibition in an instant in a death-like calmness of countenance.
Go to the dark-haired daughter and say, Magua waits to speak. The father will remember what the child promises.
Duncan, who interpreted this speech to express a wish for some additional pledge that the promised gifts should not be withheld, slowly and reluctantly repaired to the place where the sisters were now resting from their fatigue, to communicate its purport to Cora. "You understand the nature of an Indian's wishes?" he concluded, as he led her toward the place where she was expected. "And must be prodigal of your offers of powder and blankets. Ardent spirits are, however, the most prized by such as he. Nor would he be amiss to add some boon from your hand, with that grace you so well know how to practice. Remember, Cora, that on your presence of mind and ingenuity, even your life, as well as that of Alice, may in some measure depend." "Hayward, and yours?" "Mine is of little moment. It is already sold to my king, and is a prize to be seized by any enemy who may possess the power. I have no father to expect me, and but few friends to lament a fate which I have courted, with the insatiable longings of youth after distinction. But hush! We approach the Indian. Magua, the lady with whom you wish to speak, is here." The Indian rose slowly from his seat and stood for near minute silent and motionless. He then signed with his hand for Hayward to retire, saying coldly,
"When the Huron talks to their woman, his tribe shuts their ears."
Duncan, still lingering as if refusing to comply, Cora said with a calm smile, "You hear, Hayward, and delicacy at last should urge you to retire. Go to Alice and comfort her with our reviving prospects." She waited until he had departed, and then turning to the native, with the dignity of her sex in her voice and manner, she added, "What would Le Renard say to the daughter of Monroe?"
"Listen,"
said the Indian, laying his hand firmly upon her arm, as if willing to draw her utmost attention to his words, a movement that Cora as firmly but quietly repulsed by extricating the limb from his grasp.
"Magua was born a chief and a warrior among the red Hurons of the lakes. He saw the suns of 20 summers make the snows of 20 winters run off the steams before he saw a pale face, and he was happy. Then his Canada fathers came into the woods, taught him to drink the fire water, and he became a rascal. The Hurons drove him from the graves of his fathers, as they would chase the hunted buffalo. He ran down the shores of the lakes and followed their outlet to the city of Cannon. There he hunted and fished, till the people chased him again through the woods into the arms of his enemies. The chief, who was born a Huron, was at last a warrior among the Mohawks."
"Something like this I had heard before," said Cora, observing that he paused to suppress those passions which began to burn with too bright a flame, as he recalled the recollection of his supposed injuries.
"Was it the fault of Le Renard that his head was not made of rock? Who gave him the fire water? Who made him a villain? 'Twas the pale faces, the people of your own color."
"And am I answerable that thoughtless and unprincipled men exist, whose shades of countenance may resemble mine?" Cora calmly demanded of the excited savage.
"No. Magua is a man, and not a fool. Such as you never opened their lips to the burning stream. The Great Spirit has given you wisdom."
"What, then, have I do to, or say, in the manner of your misfortunes, not to say of your heirs.
Listen,
repeated the Indian, resuming his earnest attitude.
When his English and French fathers dug up the hatchet, Le Renard struck the war-post of the Mohawks and went out against his own nation. The pale faces have driven the red skins from their hunting grounds, and now, when they fight, a white man leads the way. The old chief at Horican, your father, was the great captain of our war party. He said to the Mohawks, do this and do that, and he was minded. He made a law that if an Indian swallowed the firewater and came into the cloth wigwams of his warriors, it should not be forgotten. Magua foolishly opened his mouth, and the hot liquor led him into the cabin of Monroe. What did the grey-head? Let his daughter say.
He forgot not his words, and did justice by punishing the offender, said the undaunted daughter.
Justice,
repeated the Indian, casting an oblique glance of the most ferocious expression at her unyielding countenance.
Is it justice to make evil and then punish for it? Magua was not himself. It was the firewater that spoke and acted for him. But Monroe did believe it. The Huron chief was tied up before all the pale-faced warriors and whipped like a dog.
Cora remained silent, for she knew not how to palliate this imprudent severity on the part of her father in a manner to suit the comprehension of an Indian.
See,
continued Magua, tearing aside the slight calico that very imperfectly concealed his painted breast.
Here are scars given by knives and bullets. Of those a warrior may boast before his nation, but the greyhead has left marks on the back of the Huron chief that he must hide like a squaw under this painted cloth of the whites.
I had thought, resumed Cora, that an Indian warrior was patient, and that his spirit felt not and knew not the pain his body suffered.
When the Chippewas tied Magua to the stake and cut his gash, said the other, laying his finger on a deep scar, the Huron laughed in their faces and told them, women struck so light. His spirit was then in the clouds, but when he felt the blows of Monroe, his spirit lay under the birch. The spirit of a Huron is never drunk. It remembers forever.
But it may be appeased. If my father has done you this injustice, show him how an Indian can forgive an injury and take back his daughters. You have heard from Major Hayward. Magua shook his head, forbidding the repetition of offers he so much despised. What would you have? Continued Cora, after a most painful pause, while the conviction forced itself on her mind that the too sanguine and generous Duncan had been cruelly deceived by the cunning of the savage.
Was a Huron loves. Good for good. Bad for bad.
You would, then, revenge the injury inflicted by Monroe on his helpless daughters? Would it not be more like a man to go before his face and take the satisfaction of a warrior?
The arms of the pale faces are long, and their knives sharp, returned the savage with a malignant laugh. Why should Le Renard go among the muskets of his warriors when he holds the spirit of the grey-head in his hand?
Name your intention, Magua, said Cora, struggling with herself to speak with steady calmness. Is it to lead us prisoners to the woods, Or do you contemplate even some greater evil? Is there no reward, no means of palliating the injury, and of softening your heart? At least, release my gentle sister, and pour out all your malice on me. Purchase wealth by her safety, and satisfy your revenge with a single victim. The loss of both his daughters might bring the aged man to his grave, and where would then be the satisfaction of Le Renard?
Listen,
said the Indian again.
The light eyes can go back to the Huracan and tell the old chief what has been done. If the dark-haired woman will swear by the great spirit of her fathers to tell no lie.
What must I promise? Demanded Cora, still maintaining a secret ascendancy over the fierce native by the collected and feminine dignity of her presence.
When Magua left his people, his wife was given to another chief. He has now made friends with the Hurons, and will go back to the graves of his tribe on the shores of the Great Lake. Let the daughter of the English chief follow, and live in his wigwam forever.
However revolting a proposal of such a character might prove to Cora, she retained, notwithstanding her powerful disgust, sufficient self-command to reply without betraying the weakness. And what pleasure would Magua find in sharing his cabin with a wife he did not love, one whom would be of a nation and color different from his own? It would be better to take the gold of Monroe and buy the heart of some Huron maid with his gifts. The Indian made no reply for near a minute, but bent his fierce looks on the countenance of Cora in such wavering glances that her eyes sank with shame, under an impression that for the first time they encountered an expression that no chaste female might endure. While she was shrinking within herself, in dread of having her ears wounded by some proposal still more shocking than the last, the voice of Magua answered, in its tones of deepest malignancy.
When the blows scorched the back of the Huron, he would know where to find a woman to feel the smart. The daughter of Monroe would draw his water, hoe his corn, cook his venison. The body of the greyhead would sleep among his cannon, but his heart would lie within reach of the knife of Le Subtil.
Monster! Well dost thou deserve thy treacherous name, cried Cora, in an ungovernable burst of filial indignation. None but a fiend could meditate such a vengeance. But thou overratest thy power. You shall find it is in truth the heart of Monroe you hold, and that it will defy your utmost malice. The Indian answered this bold defiance by a ghastly smile that showed an unaltered purpose, while he motioned her away as if to close the conference forever. Cora, already regretting her precipitation, was obliged to comply, for Magua instantly left the spot and approached his gluttonous comrades. Hayward flew to the side of the agitated female and demanded the result of a dialogue that he had watched at a distance with so much interest. But, unwilling to alarm the fears of Alice, she evaded a direct reply, betraying only by her anxious looks fastened on the slightest movements of her captors. To the reiterated and earnest questions of her sister concerning their probable destination, she made no other answer than by pointing towards the dark group with an agitation she could not control, and murmuring as she folded Alice to her bosom. There, there. Read our fortunes in their faces. We shall see. We shall see. The action and the choked utterance of Cora spoke more impressively than any words, and quickly drew the attention of her companions on that spot where her own was riveted with an intenseness that nothing but the importance of the stake could create. When Magua reached the cluster of lolling savages who, gorged with their disgusting meal, lay stretched on the earth in brutal indulgence. He commenced speaking with the dignity of an Indian chief. The first syllables he uttered had the effect to cause his listeners to raise themselves in attitudes of respectful attention. As the Huron used his native language, the prisoners, notwithstanding the caution of the natives had kept them within the swings of their tomahawks, could only conjecture the substance of his harangue with the nature of the significant gestures with which an Indian always illustrates his eloquence. At first, the language, as well as the action of Magua, appeared calm and deliberative. When he had succeeded in sufficiently awakening the attention of his comrades, Hayward fancied, by his pointing so frequently toward the direction of the Great Lakes that he spoke of the land of their fathers and of their distant tribe. Frequent indications of applause escaped the listeners who, as they uttered the expressive "Huh!" looked at each other in commendation of the speaker. Le Renard was too skillful to neglect this advantage. He now spoke of the long and painful route by which they had left those spacious grounds and happy villages, to come and battle against the enemies of their Canadian fathers. He enumerated the warriors of the party, their several merits, their frequent services to the nation, their wounds, and the number of the scalps they had taken. Whenever he alluded to any present, and the subtle Indian neglected none, the dark countenance of the flattered individual gleamed with exultation, nor did he even hesitate to assert the truth of the words by gestures of applause and confirmation. Then the voice of the speaker fell and lost the loud, animated tones of triumph with which he had enumerated their deeds of success and victory. He described the cataract of the Glens, the impregnable position of its rocky island with its caverns and its numerous rapids and whirlpools. He named the name of La Longue Carabine, and paused until the forest beneath them had sent up the last echo of a loud and long yell, with which the hated appellation was received. He pointed towards the youthful military captive and described the death of a favorite warrior who had been precipitated into the deep ravine by his hand. He not only mentioned the fate of him who, hanging between heaven and earth, had presented such a spectacle of horror to the whole band, but he acted anew the terrors of his situation, his resolution and his death, on the branches of a sapling, and finally he rapidly recounted the manner in which each of his friends had fallen, never failing to touch upon their courage and their most acknowledged virtues. When this recital of events was ended, his voice once more changed, and became plaintive and even musical in its low guttural sounds. He now spoke of the wives and children of the slain, their destitution, their misery, both physical and moral, their distance, and, at last, of their unavenged wrongs. Then suddenly lifting his voice to a pitch of a terrific energy, he concluded by demanding,
"Are the Hurons dogs to bear this? Who shall say to the wife of Minogwa that the fishes have his scalp, and that his nation have not taken revenge? Who will dare meet the mother of Wasawatimi, the scornful woman with his hands clean? What shall be said to the old men when they ask us for scalps, and we have not a hair from the white head to give them? The women will point their fingers at us. There is a dark spot on the names of the Hurons, and it must be hid in blood."
His voice was no longer audible in the burst of rage which now broke into the air, as if the wood, instead of containing so small a band, was filled with the nation. During the foregoing address, the progress of the speaker was too plainly read by those most interested in his success through the medium of the countenances of the men he addressed. They had answered his melancholy and mourning by sympathy and sorrow, his assertions by gestures of confirmation, and his boasting with the exultation of savages. When he spoke of courage, their looks were firm and responsive. When he alluded to their injury, their eyes kindled with fury. When he mentioned the taunts of the women, they dropped their heads in shame. But when he pointed out their means of vengeance, he struck a chord which never failed to thrill in the breast of an Indian. With the first intimation that it was within their reach, the whole band sprang upon their feet as one man. Giving utterance to their rage in the most frantic cries, they rushed upon their prisoners in a body with drawn knives and uplifted tomahawks. Hayward threw himself between the sisters and the foremost, whom he grappled with a desperate strength for that a moment checked his violence. This unexpected resistance gave Magua time to interpose, and with a rapid enunciation and animated gesture, he drew the attention of the band again to himself. In that language he knew so well how to assume, he diverted his comrades from their instant purpose and invited them to prolong the misery of their victims. His proposal was received with acclamations and executed with the swiftness of thought. Two powerful warriors cast themselves on Hayward, while another was occupied in securing the less active singing master. Neither of the captives, however, submitted without a desperate though fruitless struggle. Even David hurled his assailant to the earth, nor was Hayward secured until the victory over his companion enabled the Indians to direct their united force to that object. He was then bound and fastened to the body of a sapling, on whose branches Magua had acted the pantomime of the falling Huron. When the young soldier regained his recollection, he had the painful certainty before his eyes that a common fate was intended for the whole party. On his right was Cora, in a durance similar to his own, pale and agitated, but with an eye whose steady look still read the proceedings of their enemies. On his left, the withes which bound her to a pine performed that office for Alice, which her trembling limbs refused, and alone kept her fragile form from sinking. His hands were clasped before her in prayer, but instead of looking upward, that power which alone could rescue them, her unconscious looks wandered to the countenance of Duncan with infantile dependency. David had contended, and the novelty of the circumstance held him silent, in deliberation on the propriety of the unusual occurrence. The vengeance of the Hurons had now taken a new direction, and they prepared to execute it with that barbarous ingenuity with which they familiarized by the practice of centuries. Some sought knots to raise the blazing pile. One was riving the splinters of pine in order to pierce the flesh of their captains with the burning fragments, and others bent the top of two saplings to the earth in order to suspend Hayward by the arms between the recoiling branches. But the vengeance of Magua sought a deeper and more malignant enjoyment. While the less refined monsters of the band prepared before the eyes of those who were to suffer those well-known and vulgar means of torture, he approached Cora and pointed out with the most malign expression of countenance the speedy fate that awaited her.
"Ha!" he added. "What says the daughter of Monroe? Her head is too good to find a pillow in the wigwam of Le Renard. Will she like it better when it rolls about this hill, a plaything for the wolves? Her bosom cannot nurse the children of a Huron. She will see it spit upon by Indians."
"What means the monster?" demanded the astonished Hayward.
"Nothing,"
was the firm reply. "He is a savage, a barbarous and ignorant savage, and knows not what he does. Let us find leisure with our dying breath to ask for him penitence and pardon."
"Pardon,"
echoed the fierce Huron, mistaking in his anger the meaning of her words.
"The memory of an Indian is no longer than the arm of the pale faces. His mercy shorter than their justice. Say, shall I send the yellow hair to her father? And will you follow Magua to the Great Lakes to carry his water, yet feed him with corn?"
Cora beckoned him away with an emotion of disgust she could not control. "Leave me," she said, with a solemnity that for a moment checked the barbarity of the Indian. "You mingle bitterness in my prayers. You stand between me and my God." The slight impression produced on the savage was, however, soon forgotten, and he continued pointing with taunting irony toward Alice.
"Look, the child weeps. She is too young to die. Send her to Monroe to comb his gray hairs and keep life in the heart of the old man."
Cora could not resist the desire to look upon her youthful sister, in whose eyes she met an imploring glance that betrayed the longings of nature. "Oh, what says he, dearest Cora?" asked the trembling voice of Alice. "Did he speak of sending me to our father?" For many moments the elder sister looked upon the younger, with a countenance that wavered with powerful and contending emotions. At length she spoke, through her tones, though her tones had lost their rich and calm fullness, in an expression of tenderness that seemed maternal. "Alice," she said, "the Huron offers us both life, nay, more than both. He offers to restore Duncan, our invaluable Duncan, as well as you, to our friends, to our father, to our heart-stricken, childless father, if I will bow down this rebellious, stubborn pride of mine and consent." Her voice became choked, and clasping her hands, she looked upward as if seeking in her agony intelligence from a wisdom that was infinite. "Say on," cried Alice. "To what, dearest Cora?" "Oh, that the proffer were made to me! To save you, to cheer our aged father, to restore Duncan, how cheerfully could I die!" "Die?" repeated Cora, with a calmer and firmer voice. "That were easy. Perhaps the alternative may not be less so. He would have me," she continued, her accents sinking under a deep consciousness of the degradation of the proposal, "follow him to the wilderness, go to the habitation of the Hurons, to remain there, in short, to become his wife. Speak then, Alice, child of my affection, sister of my love, and you too, Major Hayward, aid my weak reason with your counsel. Is life to be purchased by such a sacrifice? Will you, Alice, receive it at my hands at such a price? And you, Duncan, guide me, control me between you, for I am wholly yours." "Would I?" echoed the indignant and astonished youth. "Cora, Cora, you jest with our misery. Name not the horrid alternative again. The thought itself is worse than 1,000 deaths." "That such would be your answer I well knew," exclaimed Cora, her cheeks flushing, and her dark eyes once more sparkling with the lingering emotions of a woman. "What says my Alice? For her I will submit without another murmur." Although both Hayward and Cora listened with painful suspense and the deepest attention, no sounds were heard in reply. It appeared as if the delicate and sensitive form of Alice would shrink into itself as she listened to this proposal. Her arms had fallen lengthwise before her, the fingers moving in slight convulsions. Her head dropped from her bosom, and her whole person seemed suspended against the tree, looking like some beautiful emblem of the wounded delicacy of her sex, devoid of animation and yet keenly conscious. In a few moments, however, her head began to move slowly in a sign of deep, unconquerable disapprobation. "No, no, no. Better that we die as we lived, together."
"Then die!" shouted Magua, hurling his tomahawk with violence at the unresisting speaker,
and gnashing his teeth with a rage that could no longer be bridled at this sudden exhibition of firmness in the one he believed the weakest of the party. The axe cleaved the air in front of Hayward, and cutting some of the flowering ringlets of Alice, quivered in the tree above her head. The sight maddened Duncan to desperation. Collecting all his energies in one effort, he snapped the twigs which bound him and rushed upon the savage, who was preparing, with loud yells and more deliberate aim, to repeat the blow. They encountered, grappled, and fell to the earth together. The naked body of his antagonist afforded Hayward no means of holding his adversary, who glided from his grasp and rose again with one knee on his chest, pressing him down with the weight of a giant. Duncan already saw the knife gleaming in the air when a whistling sound swept past him and was rather accompanied than followed by the sharp crack of a rifle. He felt his breast relieved from the load it had endured. He saw the savage expression of his adversary's countenance change to a look of vacant wildness when the Indian fell dead on the faded leaves by his side. Chapter 12. Clo. I am gone, sire, and anon, sire, I'll be with you again. 12th Night. The Hurons stood aghast at this sudden visitation of death on one of their band, but as they regarded the fatal accuracy of an aim which had dared to immolate an enemy at so much hazard to a friend, the name of La Longue Carabine burst simultaneously from every lip and was succeeded by a wild and a sort of plaintive howl. The cry was answered by a loud shot from a little thicket where the incautious party had piled their arms, and at the next moment Hawkeye, too eager to load the rifle he had regained, was seen advancing upon them, brandishing the clubbed weapon and cutting the air with wide and powerful sweeps. Bold and rapid as was the progress of the scout, it was exceeded by that of a light and vigorous form which, bounding past him, leaped with incredible activity and daring into the very center of the Hurons, where it stood, whirling a tomahawk and flourishing a glittering knife with fearful menaces in front of Cora. Quicker than the thoughts could follow those unexpected and audacious movements, an image, armed in the emblematic panoply of death, glided before their eyes and assumed a threatening attitude at the other sides. The savage tormentors recoiled before these warlike intruders and uttered, as they appeared in such quick succession, the often repeated and peculiar exclamations of surprise, followed by the well-known and dreaded appellations of "Le Cerf Agile! Le Gros Serpent!" But the wary and vigilant leader of the Hurons was not so easily disconcerted. Casting his keen eyes around the little plain, he comprehended the nature of the assault at a glance, and encouraging his followers by his voice as well as by his example, he unsheathed his long and dangerous knife and rushed with a loud whoop upon the unexpected Chingachgook. It was the signal for a general combat. Neither party had firearms, and the contest was to be decided in the deadliest manner, hand to hand, with weapons of offense and none of defense. Uncas answered the whoop, and leaping on an enemy with a single well-directed blow of his tomahawk, cleft him to the brain. Hayward tore the weapon of Magua from the sapling, and rushed eagerly toward the fray. As the combatants were now equal in number, each singled an opponent from the adverse band. The rush and blows passed with the fury of a whirlwind and the swiftness of lightning. Hawkeye soon got another enemy within reach of his arm, and with one sweep of his formidable weapon, he beat down the slight and inartificial defenses of his antagonist, crushing him to the earth with the blow. Hayward ventured to hurl the tomahawk he had seized, too ardent to await the moment of closing. It struck the Indian he had selected on the forehead and checked for an instant his onward rush. Encouraged by his slight advantage, the impetuous young man continued his onset and sprang upon his enemy with naked hands. A single instant was enough to assure him of the rashness of the measure, for he immediately found himself fully engaged, with all his activity and courage, in endeavoring to ward the desperate thrust made with the knife of the Huron. Unable longer to foil an enemy so alert and vigilant, he threw his arms about him and succeeded in pinning the limbs of the other to his side with an iron grasp, but one that was far too exhausting to himself to continue long. In this extremity he heard a voice near him shouting, "Exterminate the varlets! No quarter to the accursed Mingo!" At the next moment the breech of Hawkeye's rifle fell upon the naked head of his adversary, whose muscles appeared to wither under the shock, and he sank from the arms of Duncan, flexible and motionless. When Uncas had brained his first antagonist, he turned like a hungry lion to seek another. The fifth and only Huron disengaged at the first onset had paused a moment, and then seeing that all around him were employed in the deadly strife, he had sought with hellish vengeance to complete the baffled work of revenge. Raising a shout of triumph, he sprang towards the defenseless Cora, sending his keen axe as the dreadful precursor of his approach. The tomahawk grazed her shoulder, and, cutting the withes which bound her to the tree, left the maiden at liberty to fly. She eluded the grasp of the savage, and, reckless of her own safety, threw herself on the bosom of Alice, striving with convulsed and ill-directed fingers to tear asunder the twigs which confined the person of her sister. Any other than a monster would have relented at such an act of generous devotion to the best and purest affection, but the breast of the Huron was a stranger to sympathy. Seizing Cora by the rich tresses which fell in confusion about her form, he tore her from her frantic hold and bowed her down with brutal violence to her knees. The savage drew the flowing curls through his hand, and raising them on high with an outstretched arm, he passed the knife around the exquisitely molded head of his victim with a taunting and exulting laugh. But he purchased this moment of fierce gratification with the loss of the fatal opportunity. It was just then he caught sight of the eye of Uncas. Bounding from his footsteps, he appeared for an instant darting through the air, and descending in a ball, he fell on the chest of his enemy, driving him many yards from the spot, headlong and prostrate. The violence of the exertion cast the young Mohican at his side. They arose together, fought and bled, each in his turn. But the conflict was soon decided. The tomahawk of Hayward and the rifle of Hawkeye descended on the skull of the Huron at the same moment that the knife of Uncas reached his heart. The battle now was entirely terminated, with the exception of the protracted struggle between Le Renard Subtil and Le Gros Serpent. Well, did these barbarous warriors prove that they deserved those significant names which had been bestowed for deeds in former wars? When they engaged, some little time was lost in eluding the quick and vigorous thrust which had been aimed at their lives. Suddenly darting at each other, they closed and came to the earth, twisting together like twining serpents in pliant and subtle folds. At the moment when the victors found themselves unoccupied, the spot where these experienced and desperate combatants lay could only be distinguished by a cloud of dust and leaves, which moved from the center of the little plain towards its boundary, as if raised by the passage of a whirlwind. Urged by the different motives of filial affection, friendship, and gratitude, Hayward and his companions rushed with one accord to the place, encircling the little canopy of dust which hung above the warriors. In vain did Uncas dart around the cloud with a wish to strike his knife into the heart of his father's foe. The threatening rifle of Hawkeye was raised and suspended in vain, while Duncan endeavored to seize the limbs of the Huron with hands that appeared to have lost their power. Covered as they were with dust and blood, the swift evolutions of the combatants seemed to incorporate their bodies into one. The death-like looking figure of the Mohican and the dark form of the Huron gleamed before their eyes in such quick and confused succession that the friends of the former knew not where to plant the succoring blow. It is true there were short and fleeting moments when the fiery eyes of Magua were seen glittering, like the fabled organs of the basilisk through the dusty wreath by which he was enveloped, and he read by those short and deadly glances the fate of the combat in the presence of his enemies, ere, however, any hostile hand could descend on his devoted head. Its place was filled by the scowling visage of Chingachgook. In this manner, the scene of the combat was removed from the center of the little plain to its verge. The Mohican now found an opportunity to make a powerful thrust with his knife. Magua suddenly relinquished his grasp and fell backward without motion, seemingly without life. His adversary leapt on his feet, making the arches of the forest ring with the sound of triumph.
"Well done for the Delawares! Victory to the Mohicans!" cried Hawkeye, once more elevating the butt of the long and fatal rifle. "A finishing blow from a man without a cross will never tell against his honor, nor rob him of his right to the scalp."
But at the very moment when the dangerous weapon was in the act of descending, the subtle Huron rolled swiftly from beneath the danger over the edge of the precipice, and, falling on his feet, was seen leaping with a single bound into the center of a thicket of low bushes which clung along its sides. The Delawares, who had believed their enemy dead, uttered their exclamation of surprise and were following with speed and clamor like hounds in open view of the deer, when a shrill and peculiar cry from the scout instantly changed their purpose and recalled them to the summit of the hill.
"'Twas like himself!"
cried the inveterate forester, whose prejudice contributed so largely to veil his natural sense of justice in all matters which concerned the Mingoes.
"A lying and deceitful varlet as he was. An honest Delaware now, being fairly vanquished, would have lain still. It had been knocked on the head, but these knavish maquas cling to life like so many cats of the mountain. Let him go. Let him go. 'Tis but one man, and he without rifle or bow, many a long mile from his French comrades, and like a rattler that lost his fangs, he can do no further mischief, until such a time as he, and we too, may leave the prints of our moccasins over a long reach of sandy plain. See, Uncas," he added, in Delaware, "your father is flaying the scalps already. It may be well to go round and feel the vagabonds that are left, or we may have another of them loping through the woods and screeching like a jay that has been winged." So saying, the honest but implacable scout made the circuit of the dead, into whose senseless bosoms he thrust his long knife, with as much coolness as though they had been so many brute carcasses. He had, however, been anticipated by the elder Mohican, who had already torn the emblems of victory from the unresisting heads of the slain. But Uncas, denying his habits, we had almost said his nature, flew with instinctive delicacy, accompanied by Hayward, to the assistance of the females, and quickly released Alice, placed her in the arms of Cora. We shall not attempt to describe the gratitude to the almighty disposer of events which glowed in the bosoms of the sisters, who were thus unexpectedly restored to life and to each other. Their thanksgivings were deep and silent, their offerings of their gentle spirits burning brightest and purest on the secret altars of their hearts, and their renovated and more earthly feelings exhibiting themselves in long and fervent, though speechless, caresses. As Alice rose from her knees where she had sunk by the side of Cora, she threw herself on the bosom of the latter and sobbed aloud the name of their aged father, while her soft, dove-like eyes sparkled with the rays of hope. "We are saved! We are saved!" she murmured. "To return to the arms of our dear, dear father, and his head will not be broken with grief, and you too, Cora, my sister, my more than sister, my mother, you are too, are spared. And Duncan," she added, looking round upon the youth with a smile of ineffable innocence, "even our own brave knave and noble Duncan has escaped without a hurt."
To these ardent and nearly innocent words, Cora made no other answer than by straining the youthful speaker to her heart, as she bent over her in melting tenderness. The manhood of Hayward felt no shame in dropping tears over this spectacle of affectionate rapture, and Uncas stood, fresh and blood-stained from the combat, a calm and, apparently, an unmoved looker-on. It is true, but with eyes that had already lost their fierceness and were beaming with a sympathy that elevated him far above the intelligence and advanced him probably centuries before the practices of his nation. During this display of emotion so natural in their situation, Hawkeye, whose vigilant distrust had satisfied itself that the Hurons, who disfigured the heavenly scene, no longer possessed the power to interrupt its harmony, approached David and liberated him from the bonds he had, until that moment, endured with the most exemplary patience.
"There,"
exclaimed the scout, casting the last writhe from him.
"You are once more master of your own limbs, though you seem not to use them with much greater judgment than that in which they were first fashioned. If advice from one who is not older than yourself, but who, having lived most of his time in the wilderness, may be said to have experience beyond his years, will give no offense, you are welcome to my thoughts, and these are, to part with that little tooting instrument in your jacket to the first fool you meet with, and buy some weapon with the money, if it only be the barrel of a horseman's pistol. By industry and care you might thus come to some preferment, for by this time, I should think, your eyes would plainly tell you that a carrion crow is a better bird than a mocking thresher. This one will at least remove foul sights from before the face of man, while the other is only good to brew disturbances in the woods by cheating the ears of all that hear them."
"Send the clarion for the battle, but the song of thanksgiving to the victory," answered the liberated David. "Friend," he added, thrusting forth his lean, delicate hand toward Hawkeye in kindness, while his eyes twinkled and grew moist, "I thank thee that the hairs of my head still grow where they were first rooted by Providence, for though those of other men may be more glossy and curling, I have ever found mine own well suited to the brain they shelter. That I did not join myself to the battle was less owing to disinclination than to the bonds of the heathen. Valiant and skilful hast thou proved thyself in this conflict, and I hereby thank thee before proceeding to discharge other and more important duties, because thou hast proved thyself well worthy of a Christian's praise."
"The thing is but a trifle, and what you may often see if you tarry long among us," returned the scout, a good deal softened toward the man of song by this unequivocal expression of gratitude. "I have got back my old companion, Killdeer," he added, striking his hand on the breech of his rifle, "and that in itself is a victory. These Iroquois are cunning, but they outwitted themselves when they placed their firearms out of reach, and had Uncas or his father been gifted with only their common Indian patience, we should have come in upon the knaves with 3 bullets instead of 1, and that would have made a finish to the whole pack. Yon loping varlet, as well as his comrades, but 'twas all foreordered and for the best."
"Thou sayest well," returned David, "and hast caught the true spirit of Christianity. He that is to be saved will be saved, and he that is predestined to be damned will be damned. This is the doctrine of truth, and most consoling and refreshing it is to the true believer." The scout, who by this time was seated, examining into the state of his rifle with a species of parental assiduity, now looked up at the other in a displeasure that he did not affect to conceal, roughly interrupting further speech.
"Doctrine or no doctrine," said the sturdy woodsman, "'tis the belief of knaves, and the curse of an honest man. I can credit that yonder Huron was to fall by my hand, for with my own eyes I have seen it, but nothing short of being a witness will cause me to think he has met with any reward, or that Chingachgook there will be condemned at the final day."
"You have no warrant for such an audacious doctrine, nor any covenant to support it," cried David, who was deeply tinctured with the subtle distinctions which, in his time, and more especially in his province, had been drawn around the beautiful simplicity of revelation, by endeavoring to penetrate the awful mystery of the divine nature, supplying faith by self-sufficiency, and by consequence, involving those who reasoned from such human dogmas in absurdity and doubt. Your temple is reared on the sands, and the first tempest will wash away its foundation. I demand your authorities for such an uncharitable assertion. Like other advocates of a system, David was not always accurate in his use of terms. Name chapter and verse. In which of the holy books do you find language to support you?
Book,
repeated Hawkeye, with singular and ill-concealed disdain.
Do you take me for a whimpering boy at the apron string of one of your old gals, and this good rifle on my knee for a feather of a goose's wing, my ox's horn for a bottle of ink, and my leathern pouch for a cross-barred handkerchief to carry my dinner? Book! What have such as I, who am a warrior of the wilderness, though a man without a cross, to do with books? I never read but in one, and the words that are written there are too simple and too plain to need much schooling, though I may boast of that of 40 long and hard-working years.
What call you the volume? Said David, misconceiving the other's meaning.
'Tis open before your eyes, returned the scout, and he who owns it is not of an inn of its use. I have heard it said that there are men who read in books to convince themselves there is a God. I know not but man may so deform his works in the settlement as to leave that which is so clear in the wilderness a matter of doubt among traders and priests. If any such be, he will follow me from sun to sun, though the windings of the forest he shall see enough to teach him that he is a fool, and that the greatest of his folly lies in striving to rise to the level of one he can never equal, be it in goodness or be it in power.
The instant David discovered that he battled with the disputant who imbibed his faith from the lights of nature, eschewing all subtleties of doctrine, he willingly abandoned a controversy from which he believed neither profit nor credit was to be derived. While the scout was speaking, he had also seated himself, and producing the ready little volume and the iron-rimmed spectacles, he prepared to discharge a duty with nothing but the unexpected assault he had received in his orthodoxy could have so long suspended. He was, in truth, a minstrel of the western continent, of a much later day, certainly, than those gifted bards who formerly sang the profane renown of baron and prince, but after the spirit of his own age and country, and he was now prepared to exercise the cunning of his craft in celebration of, or rather in thanksgiving for, the recent victory. He waited patiently for Hawkeye to cease, then, lifting his eyes together with his voice, he said aloud, I invite you, friends, to join in praise for this signal deliverance from the hands of barbarians and infidels, to the comfortable and solemn tones of the tune called Northampton. He next named the page and verse where the rhymes selected were to be found, and applied the pitch pipe to his lips, and with the decent gravity that he had been wont to use in the temple. This time he was, however, without any accompaniment, for the sisters were just then pouring out those tender effusions of affection which have already been alluded to. Nothing deterred by the smallness of this audience, which, in truth, consisted only of the discontented scout. He raised his voice, commencing and ending the sacred song, without accident or interruption of any kind. Hawkeye listened while he coolly adjusted his flint and reloaded his rifle. But the sounds, wanting the extraneous assistance of scene and sympathy, failed to awaken his slumbering emotions. Neither minstrel, or by whatever more suitable name David should be known, drew upon his talents in the presence of more insensible auditors, though, considering the singleness and sincerity of his motive, it is probable that no bard of profane song ever uttered notes that ascended so near to that throne where all homage and praise is due. Scout shook his head, Muttering some unintelligible words, among which throat and Iroquois were alone audible, he walked away to collect and to examine into the state of the captured arsenal of the Hurons. In this office he was now joined by Chingachgook, who found his own, as well as the rifle of his own son, among the arms. Even Hayward and David were furnished with weapons, nor was ammunition wanting to render them all effectual. When the foresters had made their selection and distributed their prizes, the scout announced that the hour had arrived when it was necessary to move. By this time the song of Gamut had ceased, and the sisters had learned to still the exhibition of their emotions. Aided by Duncan and the younger Mohican, the two latter descended the precipitous sides of the hill that had so lately ascended under so very different auspices, and whose summit had so nearly proved the scene of their massacre. At the foot they found the Narragansetts browsing the herbage of the bushes, and having mounted, they followed the movements of a guide who, in the most deadly straits, had so often proved himself their friend. Their journey was, however, short. Hawkeye, leaving the blind path that the Hurons had followed, turned short to his right, and entering the thicket, he crossed a babbling brook and halted in a narrow dell under the shade of a few water elms. Their distance from the base of the fatal hill was but a few rods, and the steeds had been serviceable only in crossing the shallow stream. The scout and the Indians appeared to be familiar with the sequestered place where they were now, for leaning against their rifles against the tree, they commenced throwing aside the dried leaves and opening the blue clay, out of which a clear and sparkling spring of bright, glancing water quickly bubbled. The white man then looked about him as though seeking for some object which was not to be found as readily as he expected.
Them careless imps, the Mohawks, with their Tuscarora and Onondaga brethren, have been here slaking their thirst, he muttered, and the vagabonds have thrown away the gourd. This is the way with benefits, when they are bestowed on such disremembering hounds. Here hath the Lord laid his hand in the midst of the howling wilderness for their good, and raised a fountain of water from the bowels of the earth that might laugh at the richest shop of apothecaries' ware in all the colonies, and see! The knaves have trodden in the clay, and deformed the cleanliness of the place as though they were brute beasts instead of human men.
Uncas silently extended toward him the desired gourd, which the spleen of Hawkeye had hitherto prevented him from observing on a branch of an elm. Filling it with water, he retired a short distance to a place where the ground was more firm and dry. Here he coolly seated himself, and after taking a long and apparently a grateful draught, he commenced a very strict examination of the fragments of food left by the Hurons, which had hung in a wallet on his arm.
"Thank you, lad," he continued, returning the empty gourd to Uncas. "Now we will see how these rampaging Hurons lived when outlying in ambushments. Look at this. The varlets know the better pieces of the deer, and one would think they might carve and roast a saddle, equal to the best cook in the land, but everything is raw, for the Iroquois are thorough savages. Uncas, take my steel and kindle a fire. A mouthful of a tender broil will give nature a helping hand after so long a trail."
Hayward, perceiving that their guides now set about their repast in sober earnest, assisted the ladies to alight, and placed himself at their side, not unwilling to enjoy a few moments of grateful rest after the bloody scene he had just gone through. While the culinary process was in hand, curiosity induced him to inquire into the circumstances which had led their timely and unexpected rescue. "How is it we see you so soon, my generous friend?" he asked, "and without aid from the garrison of Edward?"
"Had we gone to the bend in the river, we might have been in time to rake the leaves over your bodies, but too late to have saved your scalps," coolly answered the scout. No. Instead of throwing away strength and opportunity by crossing to the fort, we lay by under the bank of the Hudson, waiting to watch the movements of the Hurons."
You were then witnesses of all that passed?
Not of all, for Indian sight is too keen to be easily cheated, and we kept close. A difficult matter it was, too, to keep this Mohican boy snug in the ambushment. Ha! Uncas, your behavior was more like that of a curious woman than of a warrior on his scent.
Uncas permitted his eyes to turn for an instant on the sturdy countenance of the speaker, but he neither spoke nor gave any indication of repentance. On the contrary, Hayward thought the manner of the young Mohican was disdainful, if not a little fierce, and that he suppressed passions that were ready to explode, as much in compliment to the listeners as from the deference he usually paid to his white associate. "You saw our capture?" Hayward next demanded.
"We heard it,"
was the significant answer.
"An Indian yell is plain language to men who have passed their days in the woods. But when you landed, we were driven to crawl like serpents beneath the leaves, and then we lost sight of you entirely, until we placed eyes on you again trussed to the trees, and ready bound for an Indian massacre."
"Our rescue was indeed of Providence. It was nearly a miracle that you did not mistake the path, for the Hurons divided, and each band had its horses."
"Aye, there we were thrown off the scent, and might indeed have lost the trail, had it not been for Uncas. We took the path, however, that led into the wilderness, for we judged, and judged rightly, that the savages would hold that course with their prisoners. But when we had followed it for many miles without finding a single twig broken, as I had advised, my mind misgave me, especially as all the footsteps had the prints of moccasins."
"Our captors had the precaution to see us shod like themselves," said Duncan, raising a foot and exhibiting the buckskin we wore.
"Aye, 'twas judgmatical, and like themselves, though we were too expert to be thrown from a trail by so common an invention."
"To what, then, are we indebted for our safety?"
"To what? As a white man who has no taint of Indian blood, I should be ashamed to own. To the judgment of the young Mohican, in matters which I should know better than he, but which I can now hardly believe to be true, though my own eyes tell me it is so."
"'Tis extraordinary. Will you not name the reason?"
"Uncas was bold enough to say that the beasts ridden by the gentle ones,"
continued Hawkeye, glancing his eyes, not without curious interest, on the fillies of the ladies,
"planted the legs of one side on the ground at the same time, which is contrary to the movements of all trotting four-footed animals of my knowledge except the bear. And yet here are horses that always journey in this manner, as my own eyes have seen, and as their trail have shown here for 20 long miles."
"'Tis the merit of an animal. They come from the shores of the Narragansett Bay, in the small province of Providence Plantations, and are celebrated for their hardihood, and the ease of this peculiar movement, though other horses are not unfrequently trained to the same."
It may be," said Hawkeye, who had listened with a singular attention to this explanation. "Though I am a man who has full blood of the whites, my judgment in deer and beaver is greater than in beasts of burden. Major Effingham has many noble chargers, but I have never seen one travel after such a sidling gait."
"True, for he would value the animals for different purposes. Still, this is a breed highly esteemed, and as you witness, much honored with the burdens it is often destined to bear." The Mohicans had suspended their operations about the glimmering fire to listen, and when Duncan had done, they looked at each other significantly, the father uttering the never-failing exclamation of surprise. The scout ruminated, like a man digesting his newly acquired knowledge, and once more stole a glance at the horses.
"I dare say there are even stranger sights to be seen in the settlements," he said at length. "Nature is sadly abused by man when he once gets the mastery. But go sidling or go straight, Uncas had seen the movement, and their trail led us on to the broken bush. The outer branch, near the prints of one of the horses, was bent upward, as a lady breaks a flower from its stem, but all the rest were ragged and broken down, as if the strong hand of a man had been tearing them. So I concluded that the cunning varmints had seen the twig bent and had torn the rest to make us believe a buck had been feeling the bough with his antlers.
I do believe your sagacity did not deceive you, for such a thing occurred.
That was easy to see,
added the scout, in no degree conscious of having exhibited any extraordinary sagacity.
And a very different matter it was from a waddling horse. It then struck me that the Mingos would push for this string, for the knaves know well the virtue of its waters.
Is it, then, so famous? Demanded Hayward, examining with the more curious eye the secluded dell with its bubbling fountain, surrounded as it was by earth of a deep dingy brown.
Few redskins who travel south and east of the Great Lakes but have heard of its qualities. Will you taste for yourself?
Hayward took the gourd, and after swallowing a little of the water, threw it aside with grimaces of discontent. The scout laughed in his silent but heartfelt manner and shook his head with vast satisfaction.
Ah, you want the flavor that one gets by habit. The time was when I liked it as little as yourself, but I have come to my taste, and now I crave it as deer does the licks. Your high-spiced wines are not better liked than a redskin relishes this water, especially when his nature is ailing. But Uncas has made the fire, and it is time we think of eating, for our journey is long and all before us.
Interrupting the dialogue by this abrupt transition, the scout had instant recourse to the fragments of food which had escaped the voracity of the Hurons. A very summary process completed the simple cookery when he and the Mohicans commenced their humble meal, with the silence and characteristic diligence of men who ate in order to enable themselves to endure great and unremitting toil. When this necessary and happily grateful duty had been performed, each of the foresters stood and took a long parting draught at that solitary and silent spring, around which and its sister fountains, within 50 years, the wealth, beauty, and talents of a hemisphere were to assemble in throngs in pursuit of health and pleasure. Then Hawkeye announced his determination to proceed. The sisters resumed their saddles, Duncan and David grasped their rifles, and followed on footsteps, the scout leading the advance and the Mohicans bringing up the rear. The whole party moved swiftly through the narrow path toward the earth, leaving the healing waters to mingle unheeded with the adjacent brooks and the bodies of the dead to fester on the neighboring mount without the rites of sepulture, a fate but too common to the warriors of the woods to excite either commiseration or comment.